In August 2006, inside its Virginia headquarters, America Online stopped charging for the internet. The company that had mailed out hundreds of millions of CD-ROMs peaked at 26 million paying subscribers and bought Time Warner in the most arrogant corporate merger in history, suddenly made its legendary email and software completely free. It was a desperate admission of defeat. The dial-up empire had collapsed. For years, AOL had acted as the absolute gatekeeper of the digital world, deciding what Americans read, how they chatted, and how they connected. Now the gates were thrown wide open, but the users had already left for broadband. The paradox is that just a decade earlier, this exact same software wasn't merely a service. For millions of families waiting through the screech of a modem, AOL was the internet. But the real story of America Online is not only the story of a lost subscription fee. It is the story of how America bought the future on a piece of plastic, and what happened when that future no longer fit inside a walled garden. Every week we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Vienna, Virginia, in 1989. In the late 1980s, the American family computer was mostly an isolated island. In bedrooms and home offices across the country, millions of beige desktop towers, Apple IIs, IIs, Commodore 64s, and early IBM clones sat on desks. They could run word processors, they could play games from floppy disks, but they were entirely cut off from the rest of the world. The early network that would become the internet existed, but it was not a place for normal consumers. It was a sterile, tolmene station series, totally hostile environment populated by defense contractors, university researchers, and a small subculture of hardcore computer enthusiasts. To go online in 1988 meant staring at a command line, a stark, black screen where users had to type exact text codes just to read a message or find a file. There were no graphics, there were no clicking icons. For the few hobbyists who did connect their home computers to phone lines, the experience was restricted to the BBS, or bulletin board system, a single computer, usually run by a local amateur in a basement, that allowed one user at a time to dial in and leave text messages. To access even this primitive network, a user had to buy a modem, a hardware device that converted digital computer data into audio tones that could travel over standard telephone lines. Setting it up required configuring complex settings like baud rates, data bits, and parity. If you typed the wrong code, the screen froze. If someone in the house picked up the phone in the kitchen, the connection died. This was the American tech absence. The hardware was capable, but the software was a fortress. The digital world was locked behind a barrier of technical jargon that the average consumer had no time to learn. In Vienna, Virginia, a young marketing executive named Steve Case understood that if connecting to a network required reading a technical manual, the American public would never do it. In 1985, Case helped launch Quantum Computer Services. Their first major product was Q-Link, an online service built exclusively for the Commodore 64 computer. Q-Link was a revelation for a simple reason. It did not look like a computer terminal. It used a graphical user interface. Instead of typing commands into a black screen, users saw menus, colors, and interactive sections, like a digital casino or a software library. But Q-Link was trapped within the Commodore ecosystem, a hardware brand that was already beginning to lose ground to IBM compatibles and Apple machines. By 1989, Quantum needed to break out. They developed new software designed for Apple and MS-DOS computers, breaking their reliance on a single hardware manufacturer. To mark the shift, the company rebranded. In October 1989, they launched a new service with a name that sounded less like a software firm and more like a national utility, America Online. The early days of America Online were defined by a brutal, three-way war for the American desktop. The market was dominated by two corporate giants. CompuServe was the undisputed leader, but it was expensive, strictly business-oriented, and charged users high hourly rates just to access text databases. Prodigy, a massive joint venture between IBM and Sears, was heavily funded but notoriously slow, cluttered with intrusive advertisements, and often felt like a digital shopping catalog rather than a community. AOL took a different path. Steve Case and his engineers designed AOL to be the consumer-first alternative. They didn't want to build a database, they wanted to build a digital neighborhood. When an American user installed the early AOL software, they were not greeted by a command line. They were met with the welcome screen, a brightly colored, cleanly organized menu featuring simple, clickable departments like news and finance, entertainment, and travel. The genius of AOL was abstraction. The software hid all the messy, terrifying realities of the early internet. The user did not need to know how to configure a modem. The AOL software automatically detected the hardware, dialed the local access number, and executed the digital handshake. The user simply clicked a button that said "Sign On" and listened to the screeching static of the modem as it negotiated the connection. And then they heard the voice. In 1989, an AOL programmer asked his wife, Elwood Edwards, a professional broadcaster, to record a few voice snippets on a cassette tape. Those snippets were digitized and embedded into the software. The moment the connection was secure, the computer literally spoke to the user, "Welcome, you've got mail." It is difficult to overstate how revolutionary this felt in a home office in 1991. The computer was no longer just a calculator or a typewriter. It was a communication device. It was alive. But this magic came at a steep, highly stressful price. In its early years, AOL, like its competitors, charged by the minute. The standard plan in the early 1990s cost $9.95 a month, which included just 5 hours of access. Every hour after that cost $2.95. This pricing model created a unique anxiety in the American household. The family computer desk became a ticking taxi meter. Users would log on, frantically download their emails, immediately disconnect to stop the billing clock, read the messages offline, type out their replies, and then log back on just long enough to send them. Parents hovered over teenagers, demanding they get off the chat rooms before the monthly bill hit $100. Despite the friction of hourly billing, the strategy worked. AOL's relentless focus on a friendly, colorful, point-and-click interface slowly chipped away at CompuServe and Prodigy. The service fostered vibrant communities, early online games, and heavily moderated chat rooms where people could talk to strangers across the country in real time. By the summer of 1994, America Online crossed a threshold that proved the digital world was no longer just for engineers. They reached 1 million paying subscribers. It was a massive validation of the graphical interface and the walled garden approach. But 1 million users was not an empire. There were tens of millions of personal computers sitting in American homes, and the vast majority of them were still completely offline. The market was shifting. New PC brands like Compaq and Gateway were flooding the country with affordable desktop towers. Windows 95 was on the horizon, promising to make the PC even easier to use. Steve Case knew that having the best software didn't matter if people didn't know it existed. Advertising in tech magazines wasn't enough anymore. Waiting for users to buy a computer and then actively seek out an online service was too slow. The interface was ready. America just needed a way to get it onto every desk in the country. To solve the distribution problem, America Online did not wait for customers to come to a computer store. They turned the American postal system into their personal software aisle. In the summer of 1993, AOL's marketing department initiated an experiment that would become the most aggressive, relentless, and physically massive software distribution campaign in tech history. They started mailing 3.5-inch floppy disks directly to consumers. The offer printed on the label was simple: 10 free hours. When the floppy disk gave way to the CD-ROM, a plastic optical disk capable of holding hundreds of megabytes of data, allowing developers to pre-pack high-quality graphics, audio files, and complex installer software, the campaign exploded. AOL did not just mail these disks. They carpet-bombed the American retail landscape. If you walked into a Blockbuster video store, an AOL CD sat by the cash register. If you opened a box of cereal, a disc fell out in a paper sleeve. They were tucked inside video game magazines, bundled with Omaha Steaks deliveries, handed out at sporting events, and placed on the trays of United Airlines flights. Some came in metal tins, others in neon cardboard sleeves. For years in the mid-1990s, it was nearly impossible to exist in the United States without holding a piece of America Online's infrastructure in your hand. At its peak, industry analysts estimated that fully half of all the compact discs manufactured globally were AOL promotional discs. It was a staggering logistical expense. The company spent hundreds of millions of dollars on postage, licensing, and plastic. But the math of network effects, the pattern where a platform becomes exponentially more valuable as more people use it, proved the strategy right. The physical disk bypassed the technical friction of the early internet. An American user did not need to understand network protocols or configure IP addresses. They just took the CD out of the mailbox, placed it into the disk drive of their beige gateway or compact desktop tower, and clicked Install. The software automatically found the closest local phone number to dial. It did all the heavy lifting. By 1996, the disks had brought millions of new users into the walled garden. But there was a fundamental flaw in the ecosystem. The business model was still tied to the clock. Users were paying a monthly fee for a handful of base hours, then paying by the minute for overages. It made going online a stressful, calculated event. You could not casually browse. You were always on the meter. Simultaneously, a new threat was emerging. Independent Internet Service Providers, or ISPs, were beginning to offer access to the raw, uncurated World Wide Web for a flat monthly fee. To protect its user base and keep people inside its highly profitable, carefully controlled digital neighborhood, Steve Case made a pricing decision that would permanently alter American digital behavior. In October 1996, America Online announced a flat-rate pricing plan. For $19.95 a month, users could stay online as long as they wanted. Unlimited access. The American public responded by doing exactly what AOL promised. They logged on, and they never logged off. Because the internet was no longer a metered taxi ride, the psychological barrier vanished. Users would dial in to check their email, jump into a chat room, and then leave the connection open while they cooked dinner, watched television, or went to sleep. The dial-up connection was transforming from a temporary, focused task into a permanent state of being in the background of the home. But the physical infrastructure of the 1996 Internet was not built for an always-on habit. When an American user connected to AOL, their home modem dialed over standard copper phone wires into a local AOL access center. At that facility, a physical piece of hardware had to receive the call. It was a strict 1-to-1 ratio. If a local access center in suburban Chicago had 1,000 modems, only 1,000 people could be online in that area at exactly the same time. Before the flat rate, users logged on, downloaded their messages, and quickly logged off to save money, freeing up the line for the next person. After the flat rate, nobody logged off. The result was the most famous infrastructure collapse of the early web. By late 1996 and into 1997, America Online essentially broke. Millions of users tried to sign on after dinner, only to hear the harsh, repetitive beep of a busy signal. The network was fundamentally overloaded. In American family rooms, connecting to AOL became a competitive sport. Users would set their software to dial, fail, and redial dozens of times in a row, desperately trying to grab a modem port the second someone else disconnected. Customer service lines were jammed with furious subscribers who couldn't reach a human representative. The frustration boiled over from living rooms into the legal system. State attorneys general launched investigations into consumer fraud. Class action lawsuits were filed against the company for selling a service it could not mathematically deliver. America Online was forced into a massive retreat. They temporarily halted the relentless CD distribution campaign. They agreed to issue refunds to users who could not connect, and they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into buying thousands of new modems and building larger data centers, massive facilities filled with networking equipment and servers designed to handle the crushing volume of digital traffic. It was a brutal, embarrassing crisis. But underneath the anger, the busy signal disaster proved a profound reality about the American tech market. The users were furious, not because the software was bad, but because they had become entirely dependent on it. The internet was no longer a novelty. It had become an expectation, a daily requirement for communication. Once AOL stabilized the network and the busy signals finally faded, the company's growth resumed with terrifying speed. They had weathered the storm. They had trained an entire country to pay $20 a month for access to a digital world. The disks had done their job. America was finally online. And for millions of people, the internet and America Online were exactly the same thing. By 1998, America Online was no longer just a software product. It was a cultural gravity well. In the history of American technology, there has rarely been a moment where a single company so completely defined the daily behavior of an entire country. To understand the absolute peak of this empire, you have to look at the American family computer desk in the late 1990s. The personal computer, usually a beige desktop tower with a heavy glowing CRT monitor, sat in a shared space like a den, a living room, or a parent's home office. In an American house where the family computer was a shared resource, America Online did not merely provide a piece of software. It decided who could go online, who could talk after school, what news the country read, and who felt that the digital future had finally arrived. Logging on was a physical ritual, a sensory experience that millions of people performed simultaneously. You clicked the blue triangular icon, you typed in your password, and then you waited. The dial-up modem, the physical device bridging your local PC to the global network, began its handshake over the telephone line. It was a mechanical, screeching, static-filled sound that functioned as an acoustic loading screen. It was the exact sound of leaving the physical house and entering the digital world. On the screen, a graphic of a yellow stick figure appeared, running across the interface to show connection progress. Once the static clicked off and the connection was established, the software delivered the ultimate reward, the cheerful, digitized voice announcing, "Welcome, you've got mail." That phrase became so deeply embedded in the American consciousness that in 1998, Warner Brothers released a major Hollywood romantic comedy starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, simply titled, "You've Got Mail." The movie was not just a product placement, it was a reflection of how the country actually communicated. Once inside the walled garden, the user was greeted by the welcome screen. This was the most valuable digital real estate in America. A placement on the AOL homepage could crash a partner's servers with overnight traffic. AOL controlled the news, the stock quotes, and the weather. But the true power of the platform lay in its navigation system. In the late 1990s, typing a full World Wide Web address, a URL string starting with HTTP and ending in .com, felt clunky and confusing to average consumers. AOL offered a proprietary shortcut, the keyword. Instead of navigating the open web, an American user simply typed keyword MTV or keyword Ford or keyword CNN into the software. This was a massive display of platform dominance. Major American corporations, retailers, and television networks paid AOL millions of dollars to secure simple keywords. If a company wanted to be found on the internet, they didn't just build a website. They paid a toll to exist inside America Online's curated ecosystem. AOL was essentially operating as the internet's search engine before Google had won the market, keeping users safely enclosed within its own borders. Inside those borders, the culture of the internet was being invented in real time through AOL chat rooms. These were categorized digital spaces where thousands of Americans gathered to talk. There were rooms for sports fans, for political debates, for teenagers looking to flirt, and for hyper-specific local neighborhoods. The chat interface was a fast-scrolling text box where the language of the internet was forged. The abbreviation ASL, asking for age, sex, and location, became the universal digital icebreaker. Every time a new user joined the room, the software played a distinct sound of a door opening. When someone left, a door slammed shut. To maintain order in this massive digital city, AOL utilized a volunteer army of community leaders, users who were granted free hours of access in exchange for moderating chat rooms and enforcing the company's strict terms of service. It was a digital neighborhood watch, keeping the walled garden safe, check-state, family-friendly, and distinct from the chaotic, unmoderated Wild West of the open web. This curated safety is exactly why parents trusted the platform. They could set up parental controls, ensuring their kids could only access certain areas of the software. The brand had successfully positioned itself not just as a technology provider, but as a digital babysitter. By the turn of the millennium, America Online had grown into an absolute juggernaut. The company was generating billions of dollars in revenue from monthly subscription fees and advertising deals. The software was installed on millions of computers straight out of the factory. It was no longer a question of whether a household would get on the internet, but simply whose name was on the account. The family desk had been conquered. But to cement its empire, AOL had to conquer the next generation of users, and that conquest would not happen in the living room. It would happen in the college dorm room. In the late 1990s, American university campuses began wiring their dormitories with high-speed Ethernet connections. College students no longer needed a dial-up modem or a phone line to get online. They had direct, always-on access to the web. To capture this younger demographic that was bypassing the traditional walled garden, the company released a lightweight, standalone piece of software that did not require a paid monthly subscription. They called it AOL Instant Messenger, or AIM. Instant Messenger, software that lets users send short messages in real time over the internet, was not entirely new, but AIM perfected the psychology of digital presence. The core of AIM was the buddy list, a small vertical window that sat on the edge of the computer monitor, displaying exactly which friends were currently sitting at their keyboards. The sound of the American dorm room fundamentally changed. It was no longer the screech of a dialing modem. It was the sharp, metallic chime of an incoming message, followed by the rapid clatter of plastic keys. AIM introduced the away message, a feature allowing users to leave a short digital note when they went to class, went to sleep, or walked to the dining hall. It was the absolute beginning of the modern status update. Millions of teenagers and young adults were leaving their computers running 24 hours a day, keeping their screen names active just to maintain their social presence. AIM trained an entire generation to communicate in short, synchronous, text-based bursts. By the year 2000, America Online had achieved a level of cultural and financial dominance that bordered on monopolistic. They had tens of millions of paying subscribers securely trapped inside the dial-up walled garden, and tens of millions more using AIM for free on the open web. They controlled the physical disks in the mailboxes, the software on the desktop, the chat rooms, the buddy lists, and the massive server farms routing the traffic. It was at this exact moment of peak platform power that Steve Case and the AOL leadership made a move of staggering, historic hubris. They decided that being the gatekeeper of the internet was not enough. They wanted to own the media that flowed through it. In January 2000, at the absolute height of the dot-com bubble, America Online announced it was buying Time Warner. This was not a tech company buying another tech startup. Time Warner was the ultimate American traditional media empire. It owned CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers Studios, Time Magazine, and massive cable television networks. And yet, AOL, a company that barely existed a decade earlier, a company built on shipping floppy disks and charging hourly rates for chat rooms, was the dominant partner in a $165 billion mega merger. It was the largest corporate acquisition in history. The market had spoken, and the message was clear. New media had swallowed old media. AOL was no longer just a software box on a CompUSA shelf or a disk in a cereal box. It was the most powerful communications and entertainment corporation on the planet. For the executives in Virginia, the Time Warner acquisition was the ultimate validation. They believed they had permanently secured their position as the unbreakable, highly profitable bridge between the American public and the digital future. But that exact control, the walled garden that made it so profitable, was about to become the trap. In the story of any fallen American tech empire, the end rarely begins with a massive, highly publicized failure. It begins with a small crack in the user habit. For America Online, that crack was a single, almost invisible, physical action performed on millions of computer screens at the turn of the millennium, the click of the minimize button. By the late 1990s, the typical AOL subscriber still sat at their family desk, launched the software, and waited for the familiar screech of the dial-up handshake. They still waited for the yellow running man to finish his sprint across the screen. They still listened to the voice announce, "Welcome, you've got mail." But increasingly, the moment the connection was established, the user did something that fundamentally undermined the company's entire business model. They moved their mouse to the top right corner of the screen, clicked the tiny minus symbol, and minimized the AOL interface. Then they opened a standalone web browser, usually Microsoft's Internet Explorer, and surfed the open World Wide Web. This behavior was a lethal warning sign. The user was actively bypassing the walled garden. They were ignoring the carefully curated news, the branded keywords, the weather updates, and the premium corporate partners who were paying AOL millions of dollars for exclusive screen placement. To these users, America Online was no longer a digital neighborhood. It was simply a dumb pipe, a necessary, temporary toll bridge to reach the real internet. This behavioral shift exposed the company to a massive structural vulnerability, driven by the ruthless mechanics of Force 4, convenience displacement, and Force 2, platform access. America Online's absolute dominance was entirely dependent on the limitations of the standard copper telephone line. Their power rested on being the easiest, safest way to navigate a slow, hostile environment. But the physical infrastructure of the United States was rapidly changing. Cable television companies and major telecommunications firms were actively digging up suburban streets and retrofitting urban neighborhoods to deliver a new technology. It was the arrival of broadband. A high-speed, always-on connection that didn't require a phone line or a dial-up tone, turned the internet from a destination you visited into a constant, silent utility running in the background of the home. For the American family, the transition to broadband was a physical and psychological revelation. A technician from a local provider like Comcast or Time Warner Cable would arrive at the house, drill a hole in the floorboards, run a thick coaxial cable to a dedicated external modem, and suddenly, the internet was just there. There was no dialing. There was no busy signal. There was no anxiety about getting kicked offline because someone picked up the telephone in the kitchen. The connection was 10, sometimes 50 times faster than the best dial-up modems on the market. In an era where digital culture was shifting toward downloading heavy files, like sharing music on Napster, trying to pull a single MP3 over an AOL dial-up connection could take 30 agonizing minutes. On a broadband connection, it took seconds. This is where the retention beat of the era struck. By the early 2000s, local cable and telecom providers began offering residential broadband packages for roughly $40 to $50 a month. AOL was still charging over $20 a month just for slow, metered dial-up. The math of the American household shifted. Why pay for a slow connection to a restricted garden when, for just a little more money, you could have a blazing fast connection to the entire open world? The ubiquitous physical AOL discs that had once felt like magical keys to the future suddenly felt like useless plastic. A CD-ROM offering 1,000 free hours of dial-up was completely irrelevant to a college student or a family whose computer was permanently connected to a wall jack. The greatest software distribution hack in American corporate history had been neutralized by better wires. AOL leadership recognized the existential threat. They desperately tried to pivot, attempting to negotiate carriage deals with the very cable companies that were laying the broadband pipes. They wanted to bundle AOL software with high-speed access, ensuring the welcome screen remained the default homepage for the new internet. But the cable companies had absolutely no incentive to share their subscription revenue, nor did they want to cede control of their customers' screens to a software company in Virginia. They wanted to be the internet providers themselves. They owned the physical pipes, which meant they now owned the access. The ecosystem was breaking. The AOL product still worked perfectly for what it was originally designed to do, but the American tech market around it had fundamentally upgraded. The dial-up subscription model, which had generated billions of dollars in reliable recurring revenue, was beginning to bleed out. To survive the transition to high-speed internet, America Online believed it needed the immense scale, capital, and leverage of a traditional media giant. They thought they had secured exactly that. But the corporate lifeline they had just purchased was about to become the anchor that dragged them down. The corporate lifeline that Steve Case and the AOL leadership believed would secure their empire became the structural anchor that dragged them under. The 2000 merger between America Online and Time Warner was supposed to be the ultimate union of content and distribution. AOL would provide the digital pipes and the subscriber base. Time Warner would supply the magazines, movies, cable networks, and newsrooms. But inside the combined corporate headquarters, the grand vision collapsed into a bitter, toxic culture war. Old media executives from Time Warner viewed the Silicon Valley and Virginia tech managers as overhyped upstarts riding a speculative bubble. The tech executives viewed the traditional media veterans as slow, arrogant, and out of touch with the speed of the digital age. Meetings devolved into ideological shouting matches. Important software updates stalled, while corporate committees debated brand synergy. While the executive suites were consumed by infighting, the American market around them was accelerating away. The catastrophic financial reality of the merger soon became impossible to hide. As the dot-com bubble burst across the American economy, advertising revenue vanished overnight. The massive valuations that justified the deal evaporated. By 2002, AOL Time Warner reported a staggering $99 billion net loss, one of the largest corporate write-downs in American business history. It was a humiliating financial public execution that destroyed investor trust and paralyzed the company's ability to fund long-term innovation. The core business model was bleeding from every angle. The dial-up subscription empire, which had funded the company's rise, was facing an unstoppable force: the widespread adoption of broadband. As local telecom companies and cable operators aggressively marketed high-speed internet to American households, the financial equation of AOL completely broke. Millions of subscribers who had tolerated dial-up speeds for years finally canceled their accounts, packing away their old computers or switching their default connections directly to their cable providers. The platform's user base plummeted from a peak of over 26 million paying subscribers down into the single digits, continuing a relentless downward slide year after year. The company tried desperate maneuvers to reverse the bleeding. They attempted to rebrand simply as AOL, dropping America Online to shed the image of a dial-up dinosaur. They invested heavily in portals, search engines, and media properties, trying to transform into an advertising-driven media company on the open web. But without the toll booth revenue of the monthly subscription fee, the numbers did not work. The walled garden had not just been breached, it had been dismantled, abandoned, and paved over by the open web. By the mid-2000s, the decline had accelerated from a slow bleed into a systemic corporate dismantling. The software that once greeted millions of Americans with a cheerful voice and a running stick figure was now increasingly viewed as bloatware, an annoying piece of pre-installed software that new computer owners immediately uninstalled. The brand had suffered total dilution. A name that once stood for the future of human communication was now a punchline in late-night television monologues, frequently associated with outdated technology, spam emails, and elderly relatives who didn't know how to use Google. The management teams changed. The corporate parents spun off AOL into an independent company, then sold it to Verizon, and later sold it off again to private equity firms. Each transaction carved away another piece of the original empire, reducing massive server rooms, sprawling corporate campuses, and legendary brand equity into a fragmented collection of legacy web properties. The transition was absolute. The shelf changed. The modem went silent. The users moved. The broadband arrived. The software closed. The logo remained. The habit was gone. The history of America Online is often remembered as a corporate cautionary tale, a massive internet empire that conquered the desktop, celebrated a trillion-dollar merger, and then watched its walled garden wash away under the tide of broadband and the open web. Yet the true legacy of AOL extends far beyond its corporate balance sheets, its failed mergers, or its long descent into a legacy brand. America Online was the primary architectural vehicle that introduced the general public to the digital age. When digital preservationists examine the e-waste bins, thrift store shelves, and collector forums today, they do not merely find discarded plastic discs. They find the physical artifacts of a collective cultural transition. Organizations like the Computer History Museum and Digital Archives preserve old AOL installation discs, vintage software manuals, and archived web pages not just as nostalgia, but as historical proof of how a country learned to connect. The sound of the dial-up modem, that mechanical screech of static, tones, and digital negotiation, remains an unmistakable acoustic fossil of late 20th century American life. It was the sound of a household holding its collective breath, waiting for the screen to load, and crossing the invisible threshold into a network that spanned the continent. Long after the software was uninstalled from millions of family computers and the physical disks stopped arriving in mailboxes, the behavioral DNA created by AOL survived. The instant messaging infrastructure, the buddy lists, the away messages, and the chat rooms that AOL and AIM popularized became the direct blueprints for modern social media, mobile texting apps, and the synchronous digital communication that defines contemporary society. The walled garden may have fallen, and the software icon may have vanished from the modern American desktop, but the fundamental habit it built, the desperate human need to reach across a wire and find someone else on the other side, permanently changed the world. Somewhere in an American desk drawer, an old AOL installation CD still sits beneath a stack of forgotten papers, the plastic case scratched, the paper label faded, waiting for a dial-up tone that no longer answers. See you in the next video.